I think any design leader has to sort of strike a balance between facilitation, craft execution, and what I'll call, and I don't mean this cynically, but design theater.
Welcome to Design Drives, your audio experience about what, how, and why design drives things forward. A podcast hosted by Sebastian Gier, together with forward-thinking design practitioners from around the world.
In this episode, I talk with Scott Nazarian, who shares insights about his experience working at McKinsey, Microsoft, Frog, and many other design and innovation cultures. Scott shares his insights on how design and innovation companies and departments are going within companies, what design can contribute to drive businesses forward, and his key insights on design leadership. Based on his experience from McKinsey, he also touches on how to provide impact by coming to a new problem or environment from a consulting perspective, and articulate what design can do in order to solve a business problem, and also how to show directions and ways to get there. Thanks, Scott, for the great talk, and Interaction 20, where the episode was recorded, for the support. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Enjoy. So I'm here with Scott Nazarian. I'm really excited to speak to you here at Interaction 20. You are Experience Design Director at McKinsey. You also have a history with Microsoft, being a Principal Creative Director there, and also board member of IXDA, which is also the organizer of this conference here. And you also been Executive Creative Director at Frog, and also been in education, teaching at CCA. So we're going to dive into a lot of topics from all kind of your experiences, looking at the impact of design. But maybe in your own words, you can describe a little bit your journey, why you got into design as a broader term in the first place, and about your experiences.
Sure. I actually have a broad undergraduate background in philosophy, so probably the little unusual starting place. But I then worked for a number of years in both film production and then editorial design, just prior to, I think, the what we call the bubble, right? And then I had a couple of formative experiences, working with artists and design practitioners from a much earlier era that sort of opened my eyes to, new mobile technologies, and then the possibility of what, we now think of as digital. So I kind of rode that wave between what had been analog design processes in different kinds of media, and then found my way into software design. And the key pivot point around that was probably going to the Art Center College of Design about 12 years into my career arc, and studying with Dr. Brenda Laurel, who I sought out because of her very early work in VR and augmented reality and that sort of thing. So I did that at Art Center, and I think that really allowed me to translate ideas that I had about design and media and kind of catapult that forward. And working in the early, not early actually, in the much later days of Sun Microsystems Labs, so Sun Labs, Building 16 in Menlo Park, which is actually now Facebook, or that building campuses. And then from there going to Frog, and then Microsoft, and now McKinsey. So I think the last 5 or 6 years have been fairly rapid, but I spent a long and formative time at Frog, which I really kind of consider my design home, if you will, in terms of working in the innovation space there, and then actually shipping software at Microsoft in the mixed reality space and 3D capture space, and then very deliberately going to McKinsey to understand what I'll formally call design operations. McKinsey, in my view, being an operations firm, and problem solving as management consultancies are, but that have essentially integrated design capabilities. So that's been its own kind of education in like the last 2.5, almost 3 years.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting what you're pointing out there. I mean, McKinsey really building up design capabilities in the last years, a lot of acquisitions from studios. And I think the whole, industry is changing there. I think it's taking design more into the consideration of the projects. Can you talk a little bit about that transformation that happened in that space?
Sure. I think one thing so let me just make it clear that I've heard people describe my particular background as being quote unquote blended. There's consulting, there's innovation work and invention, and then there's actual software design and software delivery, right? So having all those three kind of perspectives has been very interesting for me. Going to address your question more directly about McKinsey, they have kind of developed, or I should say, integrated design capability only in the last 6 years. And prior to that, I think there was some awareness of digital, and not just digital media, but the kinds of problem solving and generative creative work that needed to be done in order to help the organizations that McKinsey works with undergo digital transformation, right? And in some cases, these are very venerable companies. They've been around for 80, 100 years, and they're just now, in the last couple of years, coming around to offering digital suites or tools, for their customer base, which are quite large. I mean, these are big companies, and I think, in my view, what McKinsey has done is actually, it's very smart. They've seen that traditional kind of vertical methods of problem solving and facilitation that have gone before in traditional management consulting were actually not as effective at getting at human experience issues. And design in particular, and as we've been hearing at this conference quite a bit, I think design methods, and I mean, I guess until recently, design thinking, like whatever you want to call that, right? I think there are probably better terms for it, are actually uniquely good at getting at the fuzzy, human, messy experience issues. So that, I think that's the number one reason McKinsey decided to start to acquire and hire and integrate design capability into their consulting teams essentially as an expert function, so that they could start to move horizontally across some of these experience issues using, design research methods and contextual inquiry and concept sprint. Even the notion of agile is a somewhat, design forward sort of set of practices, right? Instead of moving in waterfall vertical development motions, in big organizations for IT, agile moves very quickly across things, right? And can identify broad stroke areas. So I think that's why McKinsey has primarily taken on that. And I think they were an early mover, a first adopter in that space. And now you see a lot of the other big consultancies kind of taking shape. What I think is also interesting, if I can just continue a little bit more, is when you look at the innovation firms from like a decade ago, maybe it's Frog, maybe it's IDEO, maybe it's something else, right? Of a certain scale, I think some of those studios are now, they're frankly struggling somewhat to figure out what their offering is, right? Because so much, design has gone in-house. A lot of big companies have started to integrate at the, suggestion of big consulting firms that, help sort of shape their bottom line. And it's changing, by big consulting getting into design, I think it's changing the rest of the playing field for a lot of the firms that have brought us this far.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting what you're pointing out there, how I think this whole spectrum of different agencies is changing to that, change that's happening at large. So I wonder a little bit about your personal experience where, maybe some of the projects you worked on in the past where it really clicked for you, that design can drive impact and that you can drive positive change with design. Maybe you have some projects that you can point out.
So I think, I've been doing this long enough where the spectrum of work I've been engaged in has evolved. Some of the projects I did 10 years ago, nobody does those projects anymore, or unless they do them in a lab or in-house, right? So I think innovation has largely become an internal investment. I think some of the very early innovation projects I did while I was at Frog, and I joined Frog in 2006, I think, late 2006, were essentially media and entertainment. And at that point, there was still a lot of open territory to try and tackle the patent IP, which a lot of companies wanted to do around, for instance, 10-foot user interface, right? So, the companies wanted to own the living room. And this is pre-Netflix and all of that. So we were essentially tasked by some companies to do an end run around the TV guide patent wall, right? And I think everyone knows that TV guide sort of brick wall of channels that you see or that you used to see, and you still see to some degree in cable television. Trying to innovate around that and generate new patent IP was actually a really not only fascinating but gratifying sort of product design experience, right? Because we were designing only for the large TV and turning that into kind of the smart hub, right? And this again needs to be noted that like what is now people take for granted with like an Xbox or a PS4 or even Apple TV, right? None of that was there. So it was this open territory to try and figure out, well, what kind of interfaces do we create, right? So in the innovation space, early on, early aughts, that was super interesting to me. As I left Frog and went to Microsoft, the real sort of bleeding edge work that we were doing there was not only innovation, but it was actually like practical software design. And our team was essentially responsible for creating a 3D capture application using all of the early innovative work from the HoloLens group, which is a mixed reality headset device, if you're not familiar with it. And we were taking all of that math and all of that kind of visualization, and we were crunching it down into a smartphone context with no depth sensor and only an RGB camera. So it was a large effort, and I think on the way to creating that piece of software, which essentially shipped as an SDK to another part of the company because Microsoft is just so huge, it exposed me to a lot of new visualization technologies I'd never seen before. That was hugely gratifying. So you start to see a pattern here that I am most engaged when I'm learning something new, right? And especially if it's something that really makes me look at my reality a bit differently. And then, McKinsey, like I said, the kind of work that we do there is so operations focused. I think a designer goes to McKinsey because they want to add either a skill set or they want exposure to a particular framework of thinking, right? Which is why I went to work there. I mean, my time at McKinsey has been so different from my previous postings that people often ask me, what the heck are you doing there? But once I explain it, I think it's pretty clear. It has to do with technology transfer. It has to do with understanding, like, what do businesses actually, like, what's the logic that you need to generate in order for a thing or a service to actually, like, actualize, right? To become a real thing so that, $1 billion gets invested in something, usually some large enterprise system. For example, we've worked with like large agricultural concerns to help unify a lot of their crop planning and accounting suites. I know it sounds really dry, but it's actually super interesting, in terms of these very traditional business processes taking a new shape for a very large customer base. It's fascinating because of the scale, and it's fascinating, because of all of the decision making and framing that needs to happen for executives in big, old, rich companies to get there.
I think it's super fascinating. Thanks for sharing that kind of journey and transition. I think particular looking maybe at the different experience you had as a design leader in-house at Microsoft versus from an external side from Frog and now McKinsey. What are your learnings in terms of like how much impact you can drive and maybe some of the differences in terms of the approach you bring as a designer to the table?
So if you're a design person, either individual contributor or a design leader at Frog, the reason that you're getting a call from someone is because they want you to take a risk for them. Right. And what I mean by that is a lot of organizations, they want to change what they're capable of putting into the world. But their organizations are not structured in a way that allows them to do that. Right now, Sebastian, you're probably lucky because, you work at a company that is very design forward and, BMW, and that, I think their ability to formulate and execute on a design idea is very mature. Right? In fact, probably one of the most mature. And so that is a very, very different situation than, if like a telephone company calls you up and says, hey, we really need to like figure out how telephone booths can be something different, right? Which is actually kind of a call that we got at one point at Frog. And guess what? They wound up tearing all the phone booths out of the New York City sidewalks and starting to replace them with digital kiosks, right? And so Frog was part of that kind of transition. I don't think our design was not the final thing, but that's an example, right? So being at a place like Frog, an innovation firm, is about taking risks on behalf of other people who can't take risks. So that's why you get the call. Microsoft, I think, impact is really driven by your ability to negotiate and navigate, a fairly, and I know a lot of people will think this is a bad word, but a fairly political environment, right? There are a lot of deep-seated sort of practices and rituals and business units that play together in a very specific way. And as a designer, especially when you're first kind of coming in there, you have to learn very quickly how to navigate those things in order to have impact. I mean, the impact you have is generally about how many minds you're capable of changing in the shortest amount of time. And there are many different methods you can do that with. The lingua franca of Microsoft are vision videos. So I think in the time that I was there, I did 3 of those, right, in 2 years, to illustrate, what a particular concept meant, and to illustrate that impact before, 100 developers started crunching math to go and do it, right? So that, in that sense, that's impact. I mean, impact at McKinsey, which is, impact is the bottom line, really, internally at McKinsey. That if you're not having client impact, then you're doing something wrong. And I think what that amounts to is not only delivering, in the case of design, like a minimum viable product that can then be used as an example to hold up in front of a steerco or a C-suite and say, this is the value of design, right? That's one impact. But another impact is also the kind of reportage that you are constantly surfacing for that client, and how, like, the way in which you're bringing them along the journey. Because I think increasingly, as design and integration becomes more important for these organizations, it's about that journey. It's about, advocacy and education. Like, that's kind of the impact you don't see directly, because, you're delivering artifacts, right? But really, you're transforming the way they think about how their company does business. And does design actually fit within that rubric? And the answer is yes, it does, but they have to be brought to that. And so that's impact.
I think super interesting what you point out. And I think it links to a lot of conversations that were happening in the last days really well, especially what you point out there about designing visions. If you, try to create confidence for the stakeholders that this is the right vision you want to go for, you said it very nicely before it's actually coded, right? How do you take other stakeholders along the process? Because, there you speak more of the role of design in terms of, obviously, also the craft aspect in terms of like actually creating this vision, but also the aspect of design where it's more about the co-creation, the facilitation. So I want to go a little bit about how do you make sure you bring along the other stakeholders like tech and business along and get their buy-in?
So I think one key word, and everybody will understand it, is facilitation. The number of workshops, and we'll just talk about McKinsey and maybe a little bit about Frog, because it was less of an issue internally at Microsoft. The way you facilitated was to create a vision video and then broadcast that, right? And share your ideas that way. At Frog, they had the Frog Think toolkit, which pretty much every senior design leader, sort of senior designer on up, had to contribute to this book, which was essentially a collection of facilitative methods. And they were exercises that you could pick and choose from to construct a workshop that would drive certain outcomes. And so depending on who the client was and what they wanted to create, kind of risk they were taking, we had this codified book, and you can still get a hold of these books. They exist if you're a client of Frog, or I think you can even order them. But these manuals, if you will, were kind of there to help us facilitate or bring our clients along with us on the design journey. I mean, it's no different at McKinsey, even though I don't think they've really codified it from a methodological perspective. Yeah, I mean, from like a methodological perspective, McKinsey, it certainly has playbooks, but a standard early construct in any McKinsey study is the concept sprint, and it generally, because of where McKinsey is positioned within a lot of the business leadership teams in big companies, and it's usually at the V or C level, you are working with very kind of high flying corporate teams, and you're educating them. And then in some cases, you're educating them how to actually educate other people from a design value perspective. So these workshops are constructed over the course of, like a week, and sometimes longer, it depends, and they can have different formats to basically step through all the motions of rapidly building, a minimum viable sort of product representation, right? Some kind of prototype is coming out the other end so that they can see the immediate value and they can hold up the artifact to their, to their CEO or whoever is kind of like sponsoring the whole thing, and see that and understand, okay, we see what this does. We see how you got there. We now understand the value of investing X dollars in this. So that's how we bring people on the journey. At Frog, it was very much like there was invention to that, whereas with McKinsey, it tends a lot more to be about current and future state, right? Like what's happening now, and how will this change iteratively in the future, right? Whereas Frog, it might be there's nothing now, and there will be something.
You pointed out there was one aspect about the facilitation aspects of design, the strategic side about design, the co-designing parts of design to take other stakeholders along the journey. So this is one part of design where it's more about the methodology and the process. And then it's the other side, obviously, for example, with putting out then actually from there an MVP, a vision, something tangible for the people to discuss, a vision. I was wondering, for example, with your current role at McKinsey or what you see at the moment, how much you make use of these two sides I was just explaining, and maybe which side is more important for you in terms of driver impact. I'm sure it's pretty much the mix of both, but I'm wondering a little bit, how you balance these both sides.
So I think one thing that we have to avoid in a design leadership role, and at McKinsey, that may be at the director level, it may be at the associate partner level, right? And in other organizations, that hierarchy is different, right? But it roughly equates to the same thing. I think any design leader has to sort of strike a balance between facilitation, craft execution, and what I'll call, and I don't mean this cynically, but design theater, right? And the theater of that, I mean, I'll just remark on it briefly. Sometimes stakeholders, client stakeholders actually want the theater more than they want anything else because they simply want to demonstrate what design is and does, right? So it's almost like a master class. In fact, that's a much nicer way to say it, right? Design theater is like a master class for what designers do, what they create, and so on. And so, if they're looking for just that kind of pure advocacy, right, which is what that ultimately turns into, then that's one thing. But from a facilitation perspective, depending on the scope of a study at McKinsey, it's often, there are multiple workshops, right? There are, and they're phased. Like, well, once an MVP is created, then we're actually going to continue, and then we're going to take that finished thing, which is a condensation of other insights and concepts, and now we're going to actually create scenarios around that thing, with that thing at the center, right? So, basically building a journey around the artifact it could either be another phase of a project study, or it might be the whole point, right? And then from a craft perspective, I mean, everybody who is part of a design team, at least McKinsey Design and the design, practitioners that are a part of that, who are trained in design, have had a career in design, versus perhaps traditional CST or client service teams, which are more of the, what you would find like the MBA folks, right? People with traditional management training. And I think what you find is everybody on the design side has craft. Like we know how to do visual composition. We know in some cases how to do 3D modeling. Many of us know how to draw very well and deploy, and deploy that skill in some way. Like personally, like when I'm out in the field doing design research, I do a lot of sketching to try and visually capture like conversations that have happened, right? You've seen like visual sketch notes in conference environments, like it's like that kind of thing. It's a kind of visual journaling. That's something that I do in particular. Not everybody does that. Everybody, I think, understands like the very foundational skills of how to essentially spec out an information design or wireframes, right, to show the structure scaffolding of a piece of software, right? Or in the case of industrial design, project flow, then there are actual sketches and models that are built of a thing, right? So it's all there. There's some strategy involved in how it's going to be deployed. What kind of team are we going to assemble that's going to have the right skill sets? And I think at this point, certainly McKinsey does have people who can do all of those things. So you've got craft, you've got facilitation, you've got theater. It's all happening at the same time, usually.
Yeah, I think it's super, super interesting. And I think maybe to close that topic, I was wondering, I think you pointed out the different aspects of design in the journey. And I mean, I guess the acquisitions and the whole evolution of McKinsey design, now there's much more capabilities on the craft side now than maybe compared to maybe many years ago. I wonder how far you go in the projects in order until maybe production, right? Or maybe complete execution of a new product or service. Is there usually a phase where you say, okay, then we hand it over to the internal team? Or I want a little bit about that process. Yeah.
So I think what you're really talking about there is the core capabilities building type of project, right? It's a very common type of project, and it's not exclusive to McKinsey by any means. I mean, a lot of different firms, they've either started to use that language or they've been doing it, quite a long time. But I think McKinsey's particular blend is that they bring a quantitative perspective, right? Like deep, big data sets of the company's different vectors, right? That they can bring to bear and turn into sort of a quant insight, right? And then design coming at it from a qualitative perspective and helping to understand that, again, what I was saying before, that kind of fuzzy, messy human bit, right? And when you start to merge those two things into an artifact that expresses the state of things in that company, it's actually pretty powerful. We did the same thing at Frog, probably with less access to deep quantitative data. So I think what makes McKinsey very interesting in the overall landscape, I think, is their ability and the potential to bring those two types of data scenes together. But from a capabilities perspective, by the time you've created an MVP and you've done the facilitation and advocacy and all of that, now you're at a point where you're actually speccing out what a departmental or organizational footprint is going to be for a company. Now, not every project does that, and the ones that do are usually, some between 5 months and a year or something like that, because it takes a long time to do the advocacy and to do the MVP and, to get to a point where you've convinced all the stakeholders that, okay, we need an internal design team, right? And so the final stage of that capabilities building piece, because all along we've essentially been, a proxy to, we've been standing in for like the real designers, I guess, right? Even though we are designers. And we make a proposal around, hey, you need to hire 20 people. Here's the org chart. And now we're going to help you go and source those people, right? Which is of like varying degrees of difficulty. If you're in the middle of nowhere, and so then you've got all kinds of logistical challenges, like how are you going to get designers to move out of their comfortable and hip urban centers and go live in, I don't know, I don't want to put any place down, right? But in somewhere more remote, right? And so that can be a challenge. If you're lucky enough to be working with a company in an urban center, then maybe it's just a matter of shifting talent's perception about who that company is, right? So you go about establishing a full-time employee, an FTE footprint that will then McKinsey can take a step back and kind of monitor the health of that newly created organization, advise where needed, and then eventually, disengage, at least from that part of the relationship.
Super interesting. Maybe as a last question to wrap it up, we're here at Interaction 20, looking at the future of interaction design in a way. I wonder a little bit about your perspective on a larger discussion that is happening. I mean, I guess you're pretty familiar with the McKinsey research about the impact and value of design, the DMI index, the papers from John Maeda on the Design and Tech report. I wonder a little bit about your view, where you see this going moving forward, and your perspectives on that.
Sure. I mean, how about if I just speak to McKinsey's business value of design and not John Maeda's papers? Yeah, I appreciate John Maeda's perspective. I can't really speak intelligently enough about it. I think the McKinsey business value of design, as I have understood it, it's really about a set of principles that will prime businesses to consume design in a more productive way, right? Or to develop their own capability. I mean, if you were to ask me where I think some of the design practice is going, so let's say in another 5 years, I would very much put a lot of money on the machine learning front and AI development, not in terms of, oh my God, we're going to have, super intelligences running the world, but more in terms of the education of those so-called intelligences. I think designers are in a unique position because of the human-centered research that they do, to really have a great vocabulary around how people do interact with technology, how they aspire to interact with technology, and also, looking at patterns or indices around by talking to enough people in a qualitative context in their homes or in hospitals or wherever, to actually generate a matrix of insights that could actually be structured for consumption, by machine learning systems, right? So that kind of response time and acuity of those systems can actually become more humanistic. And I think because those things are going to keep developing, I think that's going to be a big area where designers can help kind of make a more humanistic outcome for machine learning and AI, right? And then I think alongside that, it was very interesting talking to Andrew Hoppen the other day after his talk on design and governance, that lawmaking, and there are projects around computational lawmaking, right, where designers can get involved in how laws can become more portable and more global. I mean, I think that's very interesting. Like, essentially, the perspective that design has on the so-called, human-centered way of looking at the world, I think is needed at all levels of bureaucracy, of medical care, right? There's a lot that can be done in terms of the future of design and where it goes. And finally, I would say, and you probably heard this from Robert and others, underserved populations, like people who don't have the same kind of access. You and I sitting here in front of a laptop with a nice microphone, that's a privileged position, right? And a lot of people will never have that opportunity. So how do you democratize not only access to technology, but also pay attention to the diversity and richness that is important for technology to adapt rather to different parts of the world where it's going to be used. And I think designers can, effectively impact that situation as well.
Thank you so much. It's been fascinating perspectives. I think we need to wrap it up because of time, but thank you so much for your time and sharing the perspectives. Thank you so much.
Of course.
That was the episode. If you want to give us feedback on the podcast, have something to contribute to the next episode, or just want to get in touch, feel free to connect with us either on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram messages, or simply via the designdrives.org website. We love to hear from you.